Tim Burton's Batman was a phenomenon. It was everywhere back in 1989. I was obsessed. This was the first film I ever saw in a theater without my parents, the first VHS I ever owned, and the thing that made me a lifelong Batman fanatic. At the time, I would watch reruns of the 60s TV series every afternoon and play out scenarios with my colorful felt-caped action figures. After seeing this darker take, I started buying the modern comics and collecting all of the toys that accompanied the film. The Batmobile, the Batwing, man, these things are awesome, sleek, cool. These designs are the best of any incarnation of Batman. I'd even go as far as to say that the Caped Crusaders rides in this film are the best in cinematic history. Keaton, Nicholson, Billy D. Williams, the casting was just perfect, and Burton was firing on all cylinders after his work on the tremendously creative Beetlejuice.
It's showtime.
Danny Elfman's score, a near perfect movie. The only problem I have with it is the inclusion of the Prince soundtrack, which is misplaced and jarring. I'm a huge fan of the multi-instrumentalist musical genius, but his work here just did not fit. This film, along with Ghostbusters, had a massive impact on me as a child, so when the video games started rolling out, I couldn't get enough of them. This time on Rank and Review, I'm going to be listing as many of them as I can, from worst to best. As always, this is purely subjective, so feel free to create your own in the comments. This is going to be a long one, so let's just get started. Let's get nuts.
Alright, wanna get nuts? Come on. Let's get nuts!
Batman the Arcade Game is a shrill, clumsy, irritating quarter muncher that was released in North America in 1990, everywhere else the following year. From what I can tell, this was Numega Team's only claim to fame as a developer, which isn't much of a shocker. Atari added their stank by releasing it in the West, while Namco dropped it in Japan. I've played a lot of coin-guzzling machines in my days, and this thing is one of the worst. Not only is it obnoxious to look at and listen to, but it just feels lazily constructed in order to earn a quick buck. Yeah, I'm a cynical bastard, but the few times I saw this thing in the wild, I couldn't help but think that they just haphazardly stuffed Batman music, voices, and visuals in a cabinet and called it a day. There doesn't seem to be any passion here. All arcade games are loud, but this thing could be heard from the parking lot of a shopping mall with its high-pitched noises and voice samples from the movie. Yeah, it's cool that the actors and sound effects could be heard from the cabinet, but the game doesn't know when to shut the fuck up. Just listen to this.
He's going to make some art, darling.
It's a messy bombardment of clips over and over while you brute force your way through the thugs as the Caped Crusader. It gets old really fast. The controls work, but Batman skulks around like he's searching for his house keys after a long night of MDMA. He controls like a finicky, startled alley cat, which makes the combat feel sloppy all around. Even as a kid, I thought the visuals looked cheap, but I would still pound quarters into this thing because unlike the NES game I had at home, the environments were all taken from the movie. What are you? I'm Batman. What are you? I'm Batman. If you've ever wanted to give yourself a headache, this is the game to play. What are you? I'm Batman. The design of the cabinet should be enough to fire off some red flags to passers-by. There are promotional images all over this thing. They look about as tactfully stuck on to the front and sides as a 2-year-old's latest refrigerator masterpiece. It's basic, ugly, and a bit disturbing. Time to send young Billy Boy to therapy. A nice hand-drawn style would have been nice, maybe a bit of artistry, but no, that would have taken some time, thought, and money. Some releases looked much better with a sleeker black cabinet style, so I guess it depends on where you live and who put it out there. Data East and Midway were also involved with some of the distribution, but I couldn't find a lot of information on their level of input. I know that Japan got the only cocktail versions though, so I guess that's something. Batman can pick up gas grenades, batarangs, and grapple guns as he jitters his way through the side-scrolling stages. They all have limited ammo and fire a projectile. The grapple can be used to climb vertically, but it's also clunky, and enemies are everywhere, so good luck using these weapons undisturbed. Sorry to keep harping on this point, but it's just messy. The museum stage perfectly exhibits my point here. Joker traps are everywhere, and enemies just pounce on the bat flasher constantly, which results in the player having to button mash their way through it. Maybe there's a pattern that I've been missing for the better part of 30 years, but I haven't found it. Usually I just stuff this thing with quarters and brute force my way through this quagmire. All of the enemies and bosses have limited animations that make them look twitchy, similar to one of those amateur flipbook animation projects created by some of us in class to pass the time. It's all cranked up and frantic, but hey, I guess everyone was coming off the high of the cocaine-coated 80s, so there you go. This is what you get as a result.
The pen is truly mightier than the sword.
Hold on. Get in the car.
There are 2 Balls basic Batmobile stages that have you blasting at specific colored cars. They're fine and look okay, I guess, but the real standout is the Batwing. This stage is very faithful to the film and looks quite nice. John Paul White's renditions of Danny Elfman's film score are inspired. That is, when you can hear it through all of the incessant shouting going on. I just dreaded having to replay through this thing in order to capture footage. Oddly enough, it has a pretty high review score, which makes me wonder, am I the crazy one for disliking it as much as I do? It's a tough cabinet and board to find, so maybe this is a case of collectors mistaking rarity for quality, I don't know. All I can say is that even when I was an idiot kid, I thought it was unpleasantly loud and sloppy. If you like it, tell me why down below. But for now, let's move on.
Shall we dance?
The pen is truly mightier than the sword.
A lot of you are likely going to be upset about the placement of this one, but have you honestly played it recently? Okay, so for the record, this isn't a bad game. Batman the movie was released on the Mega Drive in Japan in 1990, North America on the Genesis in 91, and Europe in 92. Apparently, Sunsoft were having some issues getting it released in the West, so it is best to consider this an early 16-bit Sega title. It's on a 4 meg cart and deserves to be cut a bit of slack as a result. None of these Sunsoft games are bad, but this one is my least favorite for a few reasons. First, the enemies respawn way too quickly. At times it feels like they are just tossed into the fray without any thought or care. They're everywhere. 2 thumbs up from the Dr. Seuss estate for that rhyme. Second, the platforming just sucks, specifically in the museum. What kind of museum is this? Floating spike-bottomed platforms, endless amounts of shoddily secured chandeliers, giant chasms everywhere? Nonsense. It's nonsense. Last but certainly not least, the boss fights. They're all so jittery and quick. The big bads are either piss easy or acts of attrition with poorly telegraphed attack patterns. These encounters basically boil down to how many batarangs you have. You pretty much want to save up as many as possible because there aren't many to accumulate throughout the levels. Keep them until the end because fighting these guys just sucks. Once you've learned their attacks, they are easy to take out, but most of them only have one offensive animation, so they get boring really fast. Like I said, this was technically a very early 16-bit Sega game, but that excuse only goes so far. These fights are just underwhelming and repetitive. It kinda pains me to put this thing so low on my list. The Caped Crusader looks great, he has a happy banana smile, some stuff is well drawn, and the music is phenomenal. Naoki Kodaka returned as the composer after his work on the NES game, and it is just incredible from start to finish. Batman controls like Batman here. He doesn't have a gun to blast away enemies, and the stages all represent the film quite well. There aren't any sci-fi laboratories or bizarre mutant enemies to come up against. It's just Batman with his fists, feats, grapple gun, and an aerial somersault that only collides with baddies when it wants to. He can block like Keaton, but it only works against projectiles, which is pretty ridiculous. One would think a punch or kick would be able to be defended, but no, only bullets and rockets. It's a bit clumsy, but all in all, the game makes you feel like Batman, so it's not all that bad, man. Like I said, ammo is pretty limited, but if you don't use it or die, you can save it up for the tougher areas. Upon death, it resets to 5, but even the bosses in the vehicle stages remain damaged upon respawning, so it's very forgiving. Now that's something to smile about. blows its graphical wad early with terrific effects in the first stage. Rain, stuff in the foreground, great backgrounds. It looks like it's going to be a pretty promising ride straight out of the gate, but the following beat-em-up areas just aren't as interesting. The enemies get very repetitive, and this alley section just seems lazily designed in general. There are a few hundred platforms, several million mimes, and 18 dozen fire breathers. That's it. No other enemies. It's bland and gets even worse. The latter half feels half-baked, with stacks of enemies piled into repetitive areas only to pad out the length. The cathedral finale is filled with Davy ski jacket toupee men, one after another. Heaps and heaps of them. After that, you pretty much fight through every enemy and boss along a long, repetitive hallway before things get vertical and a new grenade-tossing baddie gets introduced. It's a far cry from the well-designed, gorgeous-looking first stage. The levels decline so drastically from one to the next. It's hard not to notice. There are, however, two exceptions. The shooter stages. As I said at the top, I'm a big fan of the vehicles from the film, and both are represented well here. The controls are spot on during these sequences as you navigate the Batmobile through the streets of Gotham, destroying armored vehicles and tanks. It's often easier to just weave through enemy fire though, avoiding as much combat as possible. They drive off screen after a while, so there's really no point risking the damage. Once again, the Batwing steals the show in the latter half of the game. I can't help but just salivate all over myself as I turn it to see the Bat insignia. The stage is over way too soon, but it looks absolutely amazing, and the music that plays throughout these vehicle sequences is just awesome. Some more care and attention, this could have easily been the best Batman experience based off of the film for me, but sadly, I don't have much fun with it outside of the excellent vehicle stages. And hey, as an added bonus, if you don't own or want to watch the movie, you can read the novel right here before you even play the game. It doesn't spoil the end, but the rest is written without even one single spelling error. So, jolly old Ocean Software developed a heap of Batman games for the computer back in '89, but we're going to primarily be looking at 3 here for this list, as they all follow a similar structure. First, we have the Amiga version, which looks and sounds the best, due to the power of the machine. Now, this is what I like to call a Brit game. The Batman combat stages are structured into mazes to meander about through. Your primary attack is the Batarang, and you get around the many platforms by using the grapple gun. There's no jump, so all of this feels a bit like Bionic Commando, only a lot less punishing. Goons are everywhere, so it's important to have good situational awareness throughout these levels, as they can often shoot or lob a grenade in any direction to hit you. Bob from the movie is a real prick in this first area. He has the arm of an outfielder and the precision of a pitcher. He was my first Batman action figure. It was a gift. I'm pretty sure my family hated me. If I was a kid today, I'm certain this would be considered abuse by a court of law. I'm getting triggered, as you young folks say. Bob the Goon sucks outside of the movie. Take it from me, don't buy ancillary character action figures for your kids. I like Jack Palance as much as the next guy, but what in the hell am I going to do with a Carl Grissom toy? I'd gladly take a mini Slade Palance though, from the man in the attic. Menacing Palance right there.
You're mocking me!
You are my #1 guy.
Anyway, it takes a fair amount of memorization and patience to make your way through the first area. Each stage has a checkpoint at around the halfway point, but you only have 3 lives and these pricks want you dead, so it's quite challenging. Your health is indicated by Batman's mug. Every hit has Joker's face taking over a little more, until it has been entirely replaced by your arch nemesis, which is a nice touch. Once you've forced Jack Napier to take a dip in a chemical bath, it's on to the first vehicle sequence, which looks incredible, with Gotham City in the background, and some really sharp vehicle effects. Basically, in the driving sequences, you'll need to reach the goal before the timer runs out, all while making sharp turns with the assistance of the Batmobile's grapple. It's fun and looks fantastic, but there are so many vehicles on the road that interfere. I just want to blaze down these streets in my souped-up ride, but ambulances and town cars are always in the way. Seriously, it's really frustrating how many cars are on the roads here. There are times when the streets are just packed, which forces you to slow down, making it feel like you're on a stroll to get bat berries and bat cereal from the local bat store instead of chasing down your arch bat nemesis. What I'm saying is that a few less obstructions would have been nice, but I applaud the developers for keeping things in tone with the film. Instead of having Batman gun down military vehicles, he is simply trying to get to his next objective. I like that. After this, we have a bit of a puzzle game back in the Batcave, which also fits in with the movie quite well. Then it's time to fly the Batwing. The objective here is to clip a certain amount of the ropes, securing the Joker's balloons. In my opinion, this is much easier than the Batmobile segment that came before, and pretty fun as well. The final stage is similar to the first one, only much more confusing to navigate, and with rats that need to be avoided. Rats that can't be killed, they do damage. Rats. It's a Brit game. Jonathan Dunn and Matthew Cannon did the music here, and it's really good. The themes suit their respective stages quite well. There are some crystal clear voice samples and decent sound effects to round out the package. The Commodore 64 version follows the same beats, only this time some of the thugs have been replaced by cops in the first stage, which makes a lot more sense. In the film, it was Gordon's men who were pursuing the Joker in the factory, so it works. For whatever reason, I have a better time playing this version all around. There are fewer enemies and they respawn far less frequently, which makes it an easier adjustment to get into the gameplay. In the Amiga alternative, the baddies appear immediately and can become quite irritating at certain points. Here, there is a gradual difficulty curve that I think works better, and I have a soft spot for that good old intrusive C64 sound. Biggest differences are in the vehicle segments, which are now displayed horizontally in both the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum versions. They work well, and I've got to say these stages are pretty great, even if I had to look up what the ZX Spectrum ones look like, because I could not make it past the first level in that one. Oh, and I tried for 3 solid hours. Here's the problem I have with the old specky version here. Enemies fire too quickly. There were times where I'd creep through the stage inch by inch, firing constantly, and they'd still get me. I know you're supposed to duck bullets and dodge grenades, but whenever I tried to do either of those things, I would get swarmed from behind. It's a bit of an issue. It was the last one I played of these computer games, so I knew the layout of the chemical factory by this point. I just couldn't get through it. The ZX Spectrum seems a bit more lenient when it comes to the amount of hits Batman can take, but it was far too challenging for me. Now these guys want you deader than dead. I didn't grow up with an Amiga, so I don't have reverence for the machine. However, I did know a cucumber sandwich eating kid from across the pond who owned a Commodore 64, so I've often revisited some of the games in that library. Overall, the Amiga version is probably the best with its advanced graphics and sound, but I preferred the balanced challenge level of the C64 alternative a bit more. The driving stages are also less frustrating and shorter in this one, but ultimately, you can't go wrong with any of these Batman games. They follow the movie quite well, and the variety between stages keeps things fresh from start to finish. Just expect a steep jump in difficulty if you decide to go with the ZX Spectrum one. The controls are spot on across all 3 versions, so that's not the problem, but again, the enemies in the latter just gave me a hard time. Good games, check them out. Yep, that's quite the frumpy, plush, portly Batman sprite, alright. And what's this? A top-down puzzler. So goofy, but I dig it. It may be a weird departure, but Sunsoft's 1990 PC Engine exclusive for Japanese audiences is just so gosh darn cute. Bat Fat from the Burton film stars in this collectathon maze game, and it's a lot more addicting than it looks. If you enjoy old-school arcade experiences, you really can't go wrong with Batman for the PC Engine. Like most people, I was turned off by this thing at first, but when I finally gave it an honest chance, it started to click. In this one, the croissant Crusader wheezes his way through 48 stages across Gotham. There are 4 set pieces in total, broken up into 12 parts, and they represent the film quite well. Craft Services Man starts out slow with a very limited batarang, but as he works off his morning box of donuts and collects icons, he gets quicker, better, more agile. Eventually, you'll be scurrying around rather quickly with the aid of leather knee-high bat boot upgrades and tossing batarangs like a maniac. The pickups are intuitively designed, so this game is really easy to get into. Things kick off pretty simple, and the difficulty ramps up gradually. Your objective changes with every new environment introduced. The first chunk of 12 has the Pork Knight collecting Smilex toiletries throughout the streets of Gotham. Then it's all about removing graffiti from the artwork at the Flugenheim, followed by a dozen bomb planting stages at the chemical factory. The last dozen reintroduces us to the streets to detach the Joker's gas balloons. All of these segments may sound repetitive on paper, and perhaps they are for some, but personally, I never get bored playing this game. Passwords make it a much more welcoming experience since you can just play through a few stages in bite-sized chunks. Get a load of this input screen too. You need to pose the little mini Batmans and Jokers to reload the desired stage. I can't think of another game that does this off the top of my head, but I like it. The enemies come in 3 varieties with different skins. There are the slow ones who meander about, quick ones who dart towards you, and the guys with firearms who stand still to shoot. As Batman, you are armed only with the batarang and are completely immobile while tossing your projectile. This adds some complexity to the gameplay as it forces you to be aware of your surroundings. Hitting a baddie with the batarang stuns them briefly, which allows you to mow them over. Whee! Watching them spin off screen never gets old. Right, so there aren't a lot of enemy types, but the stages themselves keep things interesting throughout. Just when the levels start getting repetitive or predictable, they toss something new in. There are red triangles unrelated to Batman Returns that allow your stout superhero to transport himself by way of the grapple hook. Conveyor belts, dead ends, tricky enemy placements. The level design rarely gets boring, and we mustn't forget to address the most hazardous bat trap of them all. Bruce Wayne might have witnessed the death of his family at the hands of Jack Napier in Tim Burton's 1989 classic, Batman. He is vengeance, he is the night, a dark knight with one weakness. Someone please hold his bat hand as he faces his fears. The Crepe Crusader must survive the crosswalk. Zany, absurd, Batman can and will be smoked by regular day-to-day Gotham traffic in this thing. It's wonderful, harrowing. And what's this? The graphics are colorful and character movements are fluid. There are some beautiful cutscenes that accompany the environmental transitions with extremely slick animations. Naoki Kodaka is the composer once again, and the soundtrack is unsurprisingly outstanding, with a couple pieces returning from the NES variant. I've said it before in other videos and I'll say it again, the PC engine sounds amazing. Thumping bass, great drum approximations, killer leads. Batman on the PC engine is a sexy, syrupy thing to listen to, with some sound effects seemingly borrowed from Hudson Soft's Crater Maze, a game released for the device a year prior. Lazy? Maybe, but it fits. This was actually supposed to be an action platformer in the same vein as Sunsoft's other Batman entries, but for some unknown reason, it was changed into this. There's a lot of speculation out there. Some people say that the developers were forced to produce a thing they didn't want to, and that this was their way of telling the company to shove it, but I don't know. This is a simple game, but it's also very polished, so I'm not sure if that tracks. Backtracks. Others have blamed it on Nintendo and their illegal Gestapo-like business practices, which forced developers to create entirely new games for competing consoles. I can't verify any of these theories, but if I had to pick one, it would be the latter. Who knows? All I can say is that this is a solid video game. It might not have been the Batman experience we all wanted, but maybe it's the one we deserved. There are some traditional action bits near the end that pit Batflan against the film's more memorable villains. This might be a case of too little, too late for some, but I think if you give this game an honest shot, you'll come to appreciate it. The only nitpicks I have are that using the grappling hook often leaves the Cronut Crusader vulnerable when he descends into a new area, and that there aren't enough music tracks. Aside from those two minor gripes, I think this is a solid game. Again, it might not be the best Batman-themed experience, but it's tight, fun, and nice to look at, with an outstanding soundtrack. So give it some love. Have all of you had the chance to watch the Burton cut of Batman, the one where the Caped Crusader is the size of a Lego creation in a human world, and kills all of the Joker's goons dead with a firearm? Well, this Sunsoft-developed Game Boy title is based off of that cut. Release the Burton cut. Release your anger on social media. This thing dropped a few months after the NES version back in 1990. It has the same cover art and title, but was built from the ground up for the monochromatic handheld device. It follows the beats of the film quite well, but it doesn't really play like a Batman game. Your main weapon here is a gun, which may be sacrilege to anyone who has read a comic in the universe released after 1939. We're all aware that the DC hero rarely kills, and that firearms aren't his forte, but in 1989, the franchise was a bit less precious. Burton's Batman was the first of its kind. It had its own insular, one and done story. Jack Napier took the place of Joe Chill as the killer of Bruce Wayne's parents, and Batman essentially made the Joker in that one in the Axis chemical factory. These changes likely pissed a few die-hard comic book fanboys off, but I'm fine with it. The story was solid, and that's all that matters. It's refreshing to go back and watch because it isn't spending half its time trying to set up a cinematic universe. Game developers probably didn't know all the lore and likely didn't have a lot of restrictions. Neck-beard basement dwellers weren't watching over the creation of this thing to criticize every step, so we got Batman with a gun as a result. It plays like a standard action game with Mario-like platforming, and it works because it's fun. Basically, you bounce around the busted-up environments of the film, shooting everything from thugs to mechanical creatures and gun turrets. Batman controls fairly well, but his jump is a bit floaty, which takes a bit to get used to. There are bottomless pits everywhere in this broken Gotham, and you'll be falling in them a lot until you've grown accustomed to the controls. Overjumping and underjumping is just going to happen. It's the name of the game here. Upgrades are everywhere, with a letter symbolizing their power, similar to Contra. Here's the thing though, this game often places inferior attachments directly in your path. It's very important to stay alert in order to manage your weapons. The black gun icon adds a number to your current shot, which makes it more powerful, but white ones exist as well to set it back a tick. At times, the level design plays dirty by blocking progression until you pick up items that set your abilities back. This is greasy, but kind of funny. It's just so brazen, and I admire anyone who can be this much of an asshole and get away with it. There are blocks everywhere that can be blasted, with the darker ones housing hearts, upgrades, and extra lives. Lots and lots of extra lives. At times, the game feels a bit like a platform puzzler. Batman will need to occasionally shoot blocks in order to create makeshift platforms or open up a jumping path. It's all pretty great, and I find this a terrific little portable experience for the most part. Enemies come in all shapes and sizes. You've got Ghostbusters, Many-Mans in the Yellow Hat, and early 1800s riflemen from the land of the Amiga. They're pretty easy to take down, and the game is well balanced until the last stage, which is a fairly quick, unforgiving auto-scroller. This is an infuriating way to cap off this tiny adventure. Turrets are everywhere, and the platforming is super tight. You almost have to memorize and commit to a specific path in order to reach the end, which feels artificially difficult to an unfair degree. What's worse is that there aren't any checkpoints in these action stages, so it can be quite the deterrent to get through this final environment. There are some nicely drawn story bits in between stages. The second last level introduces the Batmobile in a cutscene, but what's this? Magically, it must have transformed into the Batwing. This is my favorite flying sequence in any of these games. Yes, it takes more than a few liberties with the story and character, as it forces you to gun down millions of baddies, but it's just exciting. One button fires left, the other right. There really isn't a point to not always push them both in tandem, as baddies swarm from either direction. The bosses in these two stages are great, with exciting patterns to learn. There are two other boss battles in this game, Jack Napier and the Joker. Unfortunately, they both play out the same, and this dude in either form takes no less than 4,972 hits to eliminate. He's also a lot taller than our adorable little hero, but that's kind of a thing in most of the games we're looking at today. Batman can do a crab walk. It's not all that important, but I thought I'd just put it out there. Also, I really enjoy how the stages spin into focus. It's a really clean effect. Naoki Kodaka once again composed the soundtrack here, and it's brilliant. I mean, of course it is. So I keep saying fun. Batman on the Game Boy is a lot of fun. It flows very well until that nightmare of a last level, and has a simple, easy-to-follow art style that works well on the hardware. The soundtrack is superb, and it's a great time if you can get over the fact that your main weapon is a gun. I have a thing for these old Game Boy titles. The system had some terrific exclusives and had great 8-bit stereo sound separation at times. This is a must-have for the gray brick. Batman on the NES. Is there anything left to say about this thing? It was first released in Japan the same year as the film, with other regions getting it at different times throughout 1990. It's a super sleek, responsive action platformer with amazing visuals and an outstanding soundtrack, once again composed by Nobuyuki Hara and Naoki Kodaka. These two were prolific Sunsoft powerhouses back in the day who worked on the majority of the company's classics. The visuals here are straight up artistic, which is a bit of a redundant statement, but I can't think of a better way of describing them. All of the backgrounds have an interesting, almost abstract style with beautiful animations and an ink-like shading quality going on. I would gladly take a picture of any of these environments, frame them, and hang them on my wall. They don't necessarily complement the film thematically, but they definitely nailed the spirit and tone when it comes to how creatively dark they are. It brings Kubrick's interpretation of Stephen King's The Shining to mind. Technically, it wasn't a faithful adaptation, but it is a masterpiece in its own right, with its take on the source material. Half the time, I don't even know where I am here, or what environment is being represented, but I'm along for the ride. It's a confident, competently crafted take on the movie that I can't help but enjoy, and I'm not the only one. Batman looks badass here with a purple color scheme and solid animations. I still remember the first time I played this thing back when it was released and couldn't get over how cool it felt to leap off of walls. There's an inherent stiffness to all of his moves that feels great. He's a nimble protagonist, but there's a hefty amount of weight to his actions when he's on the ground battling foes. It perfectly matches the restricted movements of Keaton's character on screen. Whether this was intentional or not isn't really the point. I know the suit was claustrophobic in real life and wasn't easy to work with. The way it was translated to this video game could have just been a coincidence, but either way, it works. A lot of people like to compare this thing to other action titles like Ninja Gaiden for the NES, but I'm not sure I agree. Your protagonist's movements are quite a bit slower and deliberate here. The bat punch is your standard attack, but batarangs, bullets, and a shuriken-style spread can all be swapped out with the press of the start button. Select pauses. It's a bit backwards in this regard, but the start button is closer to the action ones, so maybe they had this in mind while developing this configuration. It only takes a few moments to adjust to, so it's not that big of a deal. All of the projectiles borrow from the same ammo pool, which can be filled up to 99. The batarang uses up 1 bit, the gun 2, and the dirk 3. If you're low on resources, you can farm them from these explosive pods dropped by this thing that looks like it could be from Metroid. One minor gripe is that the game resets Batman to his punch attack when entering a boss room. It's not a huge deal, but I'd like to go into my skirmishes prepared, but it forces you to cycle through the weapons when you're dropped in a new area. There are 5 locations with a few substages each. This is a pretty challenging game, but there are unlimited continues, and dying respawns Batman at the beginning of the last area so he doesn't have to redo an entire level. I dig it. Castlevania and the aforementioned Ninja Gaiden also did this for the most part, and it makes these tricky experiences much more palatable as a result. Sunsoft really enjoyed punishing players when it came to their NES projects, but Batman is relatively forgiving due to this. The end bosses are extremely challenging, but at least you get to retry and better learn the final area when you perish. It's much better than having limited attempts and being forced to replay the entire game. The interstitial animations that occur between stages are well drawn, but feel a bit arbitrary. Why is the Joker dressed like an artist here before I enter Space Lab Scenario 3000? It's nonsensical, but fine. Overall, I think the PC Engine has the best cutscenes, but these are pretty good as well. The Batmobile ones are certainly memorable, and the musical accompaniments kick all sorts of ass. It all feels like Batman, man, and I'm glad they changed these sequences from the ones originally showcased in Nintendo Power. They looked great before, but seemed to be more in tune with the comics. The ones that made it in suit the tone of the film and game much more, in my opinion. There are loads of enemies throughout each stage with wildly different patterns to learn. They're all pretty easy to figure out, but screw these leaping mutant man-monkeys. I've watched enough speedruns of this game to know that they can be pushed off screen, but I lack the skills, so I cheese them with bullets. Stop bouncing around and fight me. The bosses are all well designed and varied. Hey look, it's Killer Moth, the Electrocutioner, and Firebug from the comics. Honestly, I'm not convinced that these were designed with Batman canon in mind. I think it's more reasonable to assume that the person who wrote out the manuals simply had an affinity for the franchise and wanted to appeal to us fans. Deadshot is here as a regular enemy as well. It's like my comics were being brought to life. As I mentioned, the wall jump is super sexy, but it's also a skill that needs to be mastered. Some of the later stages include a lot of tight platforming sequences filled with traps, so it's imperative that you learn how to bounce around. Stick and move, Batman. There's no other way to explain this than to say that it just feels great. A slight tap makes for a small leap, while holding the button makes Batman launch. Standard stuff, I know, but the levels and obstacles feel perfectly designed with all of this in mind. You kinda need to play it to get a feel for what I'm talking about, but it's all just so buttery delicious. This NES game doesn't include any vehicle sections or really anything outside of the action platforming, but it doesn't need them. It is a perfectly tuned game. I think adding a controllable Batmobile or Batwing would have been too jarring and may have detracted from the overall quality here. I'm perfectly fine bouncing around these sci-fi settings, blasting and fisting my way through hordes of nondescript baddies. Punching stuff never gets old in this Batman game, and nothing feels better than getting right up in an enemy's grill to stun lock them until death. Yeah, eat it, mechanical humanoid creatures. The stages are all very open. If you make a mistake and fall from above, there's usually some stable ground to drop onto. This gives a lot of the environments an explorable quality. I really like how you can see the exit as soon as you enter this level, but it forces you to snake about down below before you make your way up top again. All of the environments are densely packed with traps and well-placed baddies. No. Oh, come on. Go bother someone else. I am the keymaster. Go bother someone else. Piss off. Batman! Batman is the man who does the things that Batman can. He's Batman. Batman, I'm a fan of wall jumping all over Techno Gotham. Batman. So that's it, a good chunk of the Batman titles based off of the first Tim Burton film. Take the time to write your list in the comments. Tell me how wrong mine is. Honestly, if I were to grade these games, the majority of them would sit around the B level for Batman, except for that obnoxiously loud arcade one. I really can't stand that thing. The rest are passable, but pretty interchangeable. I'm sure a lot of you appreciate the Sega System's entry a lot more than I did, or can't stand the cutesy puzzler released for the PC Engine. This is just my take, and I think I was pretty fair here. I like how different all of these games are, and think most of them are fun, but in my eyes, the only A+ experience is the one for the NES. There was an impressive fan game created by Osmani Gomez. It was in development for years, but unfortunately, Warner Brothers have shut it down. This company is a real menace when it comes to protecting their properties. I understand their reasoning, but they can be filthy cunts at times. The smallest bit of music or video under their ownership will get immediately recognized and squashed. I've had numerous problems with them personally, so I'll leave it up to you to find videos of this man's project. Here are some stills, but seeing this thing in motion is really something special. It would be nice if these bigger companies picked these individuals up and supported them to create their dreams. I'm sure something like this would sell like crazy. Unfortunately, Warner Brothers are mostly interested in doing DC dirty with shoddily made feature films led by hacks like Zack Snyder. Whatever, I'm not going to start off on that rant. I don't like it and choose not to support them with my money. For all of you folks who complain about this sort of stuff, vote with your dollars and force these companies to change. Bitching about it online won't make a difference. It's free publicity, and they still have what matters to them: your hard-earned cash. Next time on this channel, more Batman, so stay tuned.